Hey guys, welcome to another edition of the Right Way Wednesday. Today, Bernice Galvez Soto and I wanted to talk about students and documentation. And I don't know, I've been around a little while. We were just talking about it, 20 odd years in the field since I've been out of school. And I knew from the start that I really didn't know a lot about documentation. And to be honest, I don't even recall getting any training in undergraduate or graduate school about Medicare guidelines, documentation best practices, other than how to write a SOAP note, right? Is that what you got to? How to write a SOAP note. And we all know in the real world, there are not many of us writing a full SOAP note every time we treat, right? Because I don't know if I remember those notes were probably like a page long when I was doing them. Granted, they were handwritten, but they were still pretty long. And I'm finding that in my experience, it sort of creates this cycle of students who are graduating, going out into the field, don't necessarily have a strong basis of documentation knowledge, documentation guidelines knowledge. They're documenting. Eventually they take on students who also then aren't getting that in school, and so they're getting information from now clinical instructors that may or may not have a strong knowledge of documentation guidelines and best practices, and so it sort of creates a cycle. And I know I heard stuff from colleagues and saw clinical instructors and colleagues when I first got out of school, and that's kind of how I learned how to document. And if they weren't implementing best practices in that, then I learned bad behaviors, and I sort of had to break them as I went and as I learned more of actual guidelines. And I know Bernice actually does some teaching, so she has some experience in the university setting. And would you say that experience is similar to what I just described?
Totally. Very, very similar. I think that certain requirements do not emphasize or do not encourage specific guidelines to follow when it comes down to documentation. So it is very limited, that type of documentation training that we provide in universities or colleges. Side note to that, like you mentioned, a lot of it's reference to the SOAP note. I think that the SOAP note started disappearing as we started moving into electronic documentation versus in the past when it was charts, as well as documentation seems to be a big component, but when it comes down to clinical rotations, the focus is more to see that patient-student interaction, the clinical skills, which is important. And depending on the college and the university, each college, each rotation has different requirements. And many times, a lot of the students are not exposed or are not required to be exposed to documentation until their final rotation, which also, I think, affects how CIs, the clinical instructors, are approaching and educating on some concepts and important concepts about documentation.
Right. And it's interesting that I've been having some side conversations with other colleagues in our industry, and one in particular, Rebecca Finney, sent me a paper that she wrote with some more of her colleagues, and it was called Predicting Rehabilitation Manager Knowledge of Medicare Guidelines in Skilled Nursing Facilities. And I found it really solidified what I have been thinking about all along. And the research article is actually great. You can Google it and maybe find it on the internet. But one of the pieces of data that they collected was how many people who took the survey actually got documentation training while they were in school. And I was just going to read out that particular piece of data because I thought it was really eye-opening. Was only 30%, 30.5% said yes, they remembered actually getting documentation training in school. 48.1% said no, they knew they never got it. And 14.7% couldn't even remember. So clearly it wasn't that memorable if they got it. And so that, to me, I think speaks volumes about our role as clinical instructors and even colleagues of new grads coming out. And so one of the things I wanted to kind of pick your brain about as an instructor, what are some things as a clinical instructor you're working now? You've got a lot of things to accomplish, right? There are different objectives for each rotation, clearly, but what are some of the things that a clinical instructor can do to help ensure that students, if they're not getting it within their coursework, that they're at least being guided in good documentation practices?
I think that just like you, when you just shared those numbers with me, I was very, very shocked at. I was shocked at of the information, but at the same time, I wasn't.
Yeah.
One of the things that, as a clinical instructor or even an instructor in diverse associate programs, we require from clinical instructors to focus on projects to finalize the clinical rotation. So it doesn't matter if it's a level 1 to a level 3 or level 5, depending on the rotation. All students are required at a facility to focus on a topic that is going to assist the facility and improve some kind of the interventions or in general things. So I think that as a clinical instructor, for me, and I encourage everybody, one of these projects can actually be related to documentation.
Oh, that would be a great idea.
We're going through so many changes that Medicare, and aside from Medicare, many other payers are also asking more about our documentation being well detailed and skilled. And I think this will be a great approach, not only for the clinical instructor, but even for the student to actually go into the guidelines and do some research and provide effective and true feedback to the entire team, because these projects are actually presented to the entire team. So,
and do they go and present them back to their classmates as well?
If it turns out to be that it's an important case, yes. And
so you can have like a ripple effect.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and some colleges also have some classes which they label like a special class, and in these special classes they have guests and invites and even students who actually had a very strong project present on that to the rest of the students.
Okay.
So yes, there could be a huge positive effect, but I think more importantly, one of the things that I always feel that anybody who's a clinical instructor or takes the challenge to accept an actual student, you're taking that challenge by saying, I'm going to brush up on recent changes, update myself on what is needed. I want to show this person something that they could take over and say, like, so and so taught me that. You become an actual mentor. Yeah. And I think that this is a great eye opener to find out that students are not getting documentation right now. Our reimbursement, our the way that we're fighting AD denials, or when we're reviewing ADRs, that's what we're checking to see if our documentation is strong, and if not, how we can actually assist those individuals and provide them with training. And I think this is going to be, as clinical instructors, we need to start taking that initiative, and really, even if your student is not directly documenting, give them that challenge. Pull a chart and say, like, what would you change, or what do you notice here that is an effective daily note? And maybe many of us will be shocked to see that they might actually tell you, like, I only know the sub format. Is what kind of format is this? So,
or just talk to them about what you're documenting and why it's important. Yeah. And I mean, for me, I think the first step, if you're going to be a CI, or if you are now, is to really make sure, right, you understand those best practices and documentation guidelines first. Like, you have to really know them pretty well. I think in all aspects of care, and that's a really important one. And then that way you can begin to guide, lead, be a mentor to the students that you have.
And not to forget to reach out actually to the colleges directly, the universities directly, and say, this is the type of education I've provided. It's not, I think one of the things that we have to be careful about is not saying I'm giving you a negative feedback that you're not providing this, but based on the student that I receive, it seems there's not a lot of knowledge. Maybe this will help you. Or we work on this project because I didn't notice this on your student. And it's nobody's fault. But, I think whether you're a student or a new grad into a facility, starting with those basics and making those a strong foundation is what's going to be successful for the documentation that this person will continue to create a pattern to assure effective documentation.
I mean, I think as an industry, documentation became sort of an afterthought in a lot of ways for a very long time. But we can't really get away with that anymore, because reviewers, we've had so many people looking at our documentation now, and expecting us to adhere to those guidelines and support the medical necessity of the services we provide. And so that means we have to now bring that up to the forefront. And I do know that some colleges and universities, and if you're in one of those now, or if you've just come out of one, are beginning to add more documentation type. I've had some conversations with some colleagues of mine who are currently in the education, on the education side of that, and they are beginning to add more curriculum in regards to documentation, which is great, but I just don't know that it's happening across the board yet, and even then it might be kind of spotty. So think about that if you're a CI. Maybe bring that conversation up to the forefront, encourage your student to ask questions, to try to get more information, show them resources, and just kind of help them along the way.
Yes. And reach out with any assistance needs, even any clarification that you guys need before you provide any of this to students, because some things that we actually as an organization, as Health Pro Heritage, might be only exclusively for us, and that is not going out there, is not in every organization. So please reach out and we'll be glad to assist you or answer any questions you might have.
That's right. All right, thank you guys so much for joining us again for another Right Way Wednesday. Let us know if you have any questions in the chat box below, or send us a message and we'd be happy to help. Happy documenting.